Run faster or we're dead. The words rang out across the crumbling ruins of Adris Prime, a once thriving colony turned graveyard of smoldering steel and scorched earth. Naira's voice, sharp with urgency, cut through the cacophony of explosions and the guttural roars of the exodant hunters. The air was thick with smoke, acrid and suffocating, as the remnants of the human resistance sprinted through the shattered remains of their city, their boots pounding against debris-laden streets. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the action. Now, let's dive back in. The Exodans had invaded 5 years ago, a technologically superior species that saw humans as nothing more than an annoyance, a pest to be eradicated. They dismantled governments, destroyed cities, and enslaved millions with cold efficiency. Resistance was futile, they had claimed. Humanity had no weapons to rival their plasma cannons, no shields to block their orbital bombardments. And so, they lived up to the title the Exodans had mockingly bestowed upon them, the weak. But weakness breeds desperation, and desperation fosters ingenuity. Naira's team darted into a collapsing alley, the sound of their pursuers growing louder behind them. The hunters were relentless. Biomechanical nightmares with segmented limbs and eyes like glowing embers, designed for one purpose: tracking and eliminating prey. "We're not going to make it to the transport," Kian gasped, clutching a crude, makeshift rifle as he stumbled over a broken girder. "Yes, we are," Naira snapped. Her face, streaked with grime and blood, was a mask of determination. She glanced back, her piercing green eyes locking onto Kian's trembling form. "You don't get to give up now." A deafening screech tore through the air as one of the hunters leapt onto a nearby building, its elongated limbs snapping like whips as it lunged toward them. Naira didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon, a modified Exodant pulse gun, and fired. The shot connected with the hunter's torso, sending it crashing into a pile of rubble. But the reprieve was brief. More screeches followed, echoing from all directions. The hunters were closing in. "Naira," a voice crackled in her earpiece, barely audible over the chaos. It was Joran, their tech specialist, speaking from the hidden bunker miles away. "We're picking up a spike in energy signatures. The hunters are deploying reinforcements. You need to reach the transport now." "I'm aware," Naira growled, her teeth clenched as she reloaded. Kian stumbled again, this time hitting the ground hard. Naira skidded to a stop and hauled him up, her lean muscles straining under the effort. "Move it, Kian," she shouted, but there was no time for further reprimands. The ground trembled as a massive Exodant walker, a towering war machine bristling with weapons, emerged from the smoke ahead. Its spider-like legs crushed the ruins beneath them, and its cannons swiveled toward the fleeing humans. "Get down!" Naira shouted, dragging Kian behind a chunk of concrete just as the cannon fired. A blinding beam of plasma obliterated everything in its path, leaving a molten scar across the cityscape. "This is it," Kian whispered, his voice hollow. "We're done." "Not yet," Naira said, her gaze fixed on the walker. Her mind raced, calculating the odds, the possibilities. They had one shot, a gamble so reckless it bordered on suicidal. But what other choice did they have? "Joran," she barked into her earpiece, "can you override the walker systems?" "Are you insane?" Joran replied, "Even if I could, which I can't, it's too close. You wouldn't survive the blast radius." Naira ignored him, turning to Kian. "Cover me." "What?" Kian's eyes widened in disbelief. "Do it." Without waiting for a response, Naira broke cover and sprinted toward the walker. The hunter drones screeched in protest, but Kian opened fire, drawing their attention just long enough for Naira to reach her target. She vaulted onto one of its legs, her gloves smoking as she gripped the searing hot metal. "Naira, don't." Joran's voice was desperate now. "Override the system," she ordered. With trembling hands, she pulled a data spike from her belt and jammed it into the walker's access port. Sparks flew as she connected her visor to the machine's network, her vision filling with a dizzying array of alien code. "Joran, I need you," she said through gritted teeth. There was a pause, a heartbeat of silence in the chaos. Then Joran sighed. "You're going to get us all killed." The code began to unravel, piece by piece, under Joran's deft manipulation. The walker shuddered, its movements growing erratic. "You've got 30 seconds before it blows," Joran warned. Naira jumped clear, just as the walker emitted a piercing shriek. Its core detonated, engulfing the hunters in a fiery explosion. The shockwave knocked her off her feet, and for a moment, everything went black. When she came to, Kian was standing over her, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You're insane," he said, helping her up. "Maybe," Naira replied, coughing as she surveyed the destruction. The hunters were gone, but so was their transport. "This isn't over," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her body. "We're going to make them regret underestimating us." And for the first time, Kian believed her. The Exodus mothership hung in the stratosphere, a dark monolith that blotted out the stars. Its vast hull gleamed with an iridescent sheen, bristling with weapons and drones ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Inside its cold metallic corridors, Exodus Commander Zalzuwayar loomed over a holographic display, his multifaceted eyes scanning the chaotic feed from Adris Prime. "Unacceptable," he hissed, his voice a low, guttural rumble. "The humans persist, defying eradication protocols. How is this possible?" A smaller Exodus, its spindly form hunched in deference, approached cautiously. "The Resistance has demonstrated resourcefulness, Commander. Their tactics are unpredictable." "Unpredictable," Zalziwayar mocked, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "A euphemism for incompetence among our hunters. Send reinforcements. Deploy a Terminator squad if necessary. This rebellion ends now." The subordinate nodded, scuttling away to relay the orders. Zalziwayar turned back to the hologram, where a segment of the city still flickered with human activity. His mandibles curled into a semblance of a smirk. "Let them struggle," he muttered. "It will make their annihilation all the more satisfying." Miles below, Naira and her team had regrouped in the ruins of an underground transit hub. The faint glow of emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. The air was damp and stale, but it was a refuge, for now. "We've got nothing left," Kian said, pacing nervously. "No transport, no heavy weapons, and we're running low on ammo." "We have more than they think," Naira replied, crouched over a rough map of the city. Her fingers traced a series of marks and symbols etched into the parchment. "Joran, did you get a clean read on the walker's detonation signal?" "Clean enough," Joran replied, his voice crackling through a portable comm unit. He was still in the bunker, monitoring the team remotely. It disrupted their local network for a few minutes, long enough to intercept some intel. Turns out, the Exodans are nervous about something. Naira looked up sharply. "Nervous? About us?" "Not exactly," Joran said. "I picked up encrypted chatter about a hidden Exodus facility near the city's core. They're guarding it like it's their lifeblood. Whatever's in there, it's big." A heavy silence fell over the group. Even Kian stopped pacing, his expression shifting from fear to curiosity. "What kind of facility?" he asked. "That's the problem," Joran admitted. "The data's incomplete. But there's one word that kept coming up. Reactor." Naira's mind raced. A reactor could mean many things. Energy production, weapons development, or even a power source for the mothership. But one thing was certain. If the Exodans were guarding it so fiercely, destroying it would deal a significant blow to their operations. "This is it," Naira said, standing. "This is how we make them bleed." "Hold on," Kian interrupted. "You're talking about attacking an Exodus stronghold with nothing but a few rifles and a half-baked plan. It's suicide. It's war." Naira shot back. Her voice was steel, her eyes burning with resolve. "Every second we wait, they tighten their grip. If we don't act now, We'll never have another chance. Kian opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Naira's face stopped him. It wasn't just determination. It was something deeper. Hope. What's the plan? He asked reluctantly. Joran will guide us to the facility, Naira said. We infiltrate, plant charges, and get out before they know what hit them. And if they catch us, Kian pressed. Naira didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. Let's move, she said finally. The team set out under cover of darkness, navigating the maze of rubble and abandoned infrastructure with practiced precision. Naira led the way, her every sense on high alert. The city was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of distant combat replaced by an oppressive stillness. As they approached the city core, the ruins gave way to towering Exodon constructs, their alien geometry both beautiful and menacing. Pulsing energy conduits snaked through the structures, casting an otherworldly glow that bathed the area in shades of blue and green. There it is. Joran's voice crackled in Naira's earpiece. A holographic marker appeared on her visor, highlighting a fortified building surrounded by patrols. The reactor's housed in the central chamber. You will need to disable the perimeter defenses first. Understood, Naira replied, signaling for her team to spread out. They moved like shadows, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly as they approached the facility. Naira's heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed the fear aside. This was their moment. Kian disabled a pair of guards with a silent shot, while Naira hacked into a control panel, her fingers flying over the alien interface. A soft chime indicated success, and the perimeter defenses powered down. Good work, Joran said. But you've got incoming. Multiple heat signatures, converging on your position. We'll handle it, Naira said, her voice calm despite the rising tension. The team slipped inside the facility, their footsteps muffled by the strange, rubbery material of the floors. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the faint metallic tang of ozone. As they descended deeper into the structure, the walls seemed to close in, the corridors narrowing into claustrophobic tunnels. Every step brought them closer to the reactor, and closer to discovery. Finally, they reached the central chamber. The reactor was a massive, glowing sphere suspended in midair, its surface rippling with arcs of energy. Alien symbols and conduits adorned the walls, feeding the reactor with a steady stream of power. This is it, Naira whispered, her voice barely audible. She set the charges carefully, each one calibrated for maximum damage. The timer ticked down ominously, a constant reminder of the thin line between success and annihilation. But as they prepared to leave, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber. You dare trespass here, vermin. Naira turned slowly, her blood running cold. Standing in the entrance was Zalzuwayar, his towering form radiating menace. Behind him, a squad of Exodon warriors leveled their weapons. Seal the exits, Zalzuwayar commanded. Let none escape. The chamber erupted into chaos. Zalzuwayar's squad opened fire, their plasma rifles spewing bolts of deadly green energy. Naira dove behind a console, narrowly avoiding a blast that left a smoking crater where she had stood moments before. The reactor chamber became a cacophony of alien roars, human shouts, and the deafening hum of unstable energy. Kian, suppressing fire. Naira yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. Kian didn't hesitate. He popped up from behind cover and unleashed a flurry of shots, his makeshift rifle barking with defiance. The Exodon warriors shifted their attention to him, their shields flaring as they absorbed the impacts. Joran, Naira barked into her earpiece, we need an exit now. Working on it. Joran's voice was frantic. The facility's locking down. You've got about 3 minutes before the charges blow, and no clear way out. Make a way. Naira snapped. She risked a glance around her cover. Zalzuwayar stood at the center of the chaos, his imposing form untouched by the skirmish. His eyes locked onto Naira, and a cruel smile curled across his mandibles. You fight with spirit, he said, his voice resonating with both amusement and disdain. "It will make your death all the sweeter." "Get in line," Naira muttered, ducking back as another plasma bolt seared the air above her head. The charge's timer continued its relentless countdown, the numbers flashing ominously on Naira's visor. 2 minutes left. "Kian, fall back," she ordered. "What about you?" Kian shouted, even as he obeyed, retreating toward the far side of the chamber. "Just go." Naira fired a burst of covering shots, forcing the Exodans to take cover as Kian and the others made their way toward the nearest exit. But Zalziwayar wasn't about to let them escape so easily. He raised one of his clawed hands, and a pulse of energy rippled through the room. Naira felt her muscles seize as a wave of paralyzing force swept over her, sending her crashing to the floor. "Pathetic," Zalziwayar sneered, striding toward her with deliberate, predatory steps. "You humans cling to hope, even in the face of annihilation. It is almost admirable." Naira struggled to move, to even breathe, but the energy field held her in place. She could only watch as Zalziwayar loomed over her, his glowing eyes filled with cruel satisfaction. "This rebellion ends here," he said, raising his weapon. Then, from the shadows, Kian reappeared. With a defiant roar, he launched himself at Zalziwayar, his rifle swinging like a club. The blow connected with the Exodus commander's head, staggering him and disrupting the energy field. "Move, Naira," Kian shouted, firing wildly to keep the Exodus at bay. Naira didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing a discarded pulse gun as she did. The timer on the charges read 0:45. "Joran," she yelled, "we're out of time. Exit route coming online now." Joran's voice crackled as a portion of the chamber wall slid open, revealing a narrow maintenance tunnel. "Kian, go," Naira ordered, covering him as he sprinted toward the tunnel. She fired over her shoulder as she followed, her shots forcing the Exodans to take cover. Zalziwayar roared in frustration, his mandibles clicking furiously. "You cannot escape," he bellowed. The tunnel twisted and turned, its dimly lit walls a blur as Naira and her team sprinted for their lives. The reactor's hum grew louder, building to an ear-splitting crescendo. Then came the explosion. The blast tore through the facility, a blinding flash of light, followed by a shockwave that sent Naira and the others sprawling. The tunnel collapsed behind them, cutting off the pursuing Exodans. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the sound of ragged breathing. "Everyone still alive?" Naira panted, her voice hoarse. "Barely," Kian replied, coughing as he pushed himself to his feet. "That was insane." "Effective," Naira corrected, wincing as she stood. Joran's voice crackled in their earpieces. "You did it. The reactor's gone, and their energy grid is in chaos. They'll be scrambling to recover for days, maybe weeks." Naira allowed herself a small, grim smile. "It's a start." But even as the team caught their breath, the reality of their situation set in. The mothership still loomed above, and the Exodans would undoubtedly retaliate with a vengeance. "This isn't over," Naira said, her gaze fixed on the distant glow of the Exodan stronghold. "Not by a long shot." Kian looked at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "What's the next move?" Naira's eyes narrowed. "We take the fight to them." The days following the destruction of the Exodan reactor were marked by a strange kind of relief. The humans on Adris Prime, once cowering under the boot of their oppressors, had tasted a victory unlike any they had imagined possible. For the first time since the Exodans had invaded, there was hope. But it was a fragile hope, a fleeting flicker in the dark. Naira didn't share the optimism that had spread through the resistance. She knew better than anyone that the Exodans would not sit idly by, licking their wounds. They were a relentless force, their empire built on domination and conquest. They would come for them with everything they had. "We bought ourselves some time," Joran said, studying the latest intelligence reports on his holoscreen. "But they're not going to stop. We've seen it before. Retaliation is always swift and brutal. Naira nodded grimly. We'll be ready. The resistance had swelled in the wake of the reactor's destruction, drawing in more recruits from across the city. There were whispers of other cells joining the fight, their leaders emboldened by Naira's audacious attack. The tide was turning, but it would take more than just courage to bring the Exodus Empire to its knees. What's the next target? Kian asked, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Naira glanced at the map sprawled across the table in front of her. The Exodus stronghold at the city's core was still intact, but it was no longer their primary focus. The Exodus had learned from their mistakes. They were fortifying their remaining supply lines and reinforcing strategic outposts. The war was moving from urban guerrilla tactics to full-scale confrontations. There's a weapons depot in the northern sector, Naira said, pointing to a location on the map. It's heavily guarded, but it holds enough ordnance to level entire districts. If we can destroy it, we'll cripple their ability to retaliate. Sounds like a suicide mission, Kian muttered. That's why it's a good idea, Naira replied, her eyes hardening. We take their most valuable asset, and they'll be forced to reconsider their strategy. But we don't even know what kind of firepower they've got there, Kian pressed. We'll find out, Naira said. But we don't have the luxury of hesitation. The team assembled in their makeshift command center, their faces weary but resolute. They had no choice but to push forward. The Exodans were relentless. But Naira had learned something in her years of fighting. The stronger the enemy, the harder they fall when their arrogance blinds them. And the Exodans were dangerously overconfident. Jorn was the first to speak. I've got a way in. There's a drainage tunnel near the depot that should give us access to the lower levels. It's tight, but it's our best shot. We'll move at dusk, Naira decided. Everyone knows their role. We hit fast, we hit hard, and we get out before they even know we're there. As night fell over Aegis Prime, the resistance team made their way through the darkened streets, their movements calculated and silent. The city was tense, but there was an undercurrent of something else in the air, a sense of anticipation. Naira could feel it, even if she didn't fully understand it. The northern sector was a maze of industrial complexes and fortified Exodus installations. The depot was a fortress, its perimeter guarded by automatic turrets and Exodus soldiers, their angular forms moving like shadows in the night. Naira's heart raced as they approached the drainage tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the remains of a city once vibrant now reduced to rubble and ruin. The tunnel was narrow, the walls slick with moisture, but it was their only option. As they crawled through the muck, Naira couldn't help but think about how far they had come. It hadn't been long ago that they were the hunted, running from a foe they had no hope of defeating. But now, they were the ones doing the hunting. The tunnel eventually opened into the lower levels of the depot, a labyrinth of pipes and storage bays. The team moved with precision, their weapons drawn, and their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. We've got company, Kian whispered. A group of Exodus soldiers passed by, their voices echoing through the metal corridors. Naira held her breath, pressing herself against the wall as they moved. It felt like an eternity before they were clear. We're close, Jorn whispered. The weapons depot loomed ahead, a massive hangar filled with crates of Exodus weaponry. Naira's pulse quickened as she surveyed the room. There were enough explosives here to turn the tide of the war. But there was a catch. The depot was heavily guarded, with more Exodus soldiers than they had anticipated. Their presence was a glaring reminder of just how high the stakes were, but there was no turning back now. Set the charges, Naira ordered. We take this depot, and we take their supply line. We cripple them. Kian and Jorn moved to plant the explosives while Naira kept watch. The tension in the air was palpable, every creak of metal or distant sound making her heart leap into her throat. Charges are set, Kian said, his voice tight. But we've got about 5 minutes before they trigger the security lockdown. Then we move, Naira replied, her gaze never leaving the door. Suddenly, the doors to the depot slammed shut with a deafening clang. Naira's heart skipped a beat. "Ambush!" Kian shouted. The Exodans had been waiting for them. The security doors were rigged to trap intruders, and now they were surrounded. Zalzwayar's voice echoed from the loudspeakers, cold and mocking. "You thought you could strike at the heart of my empire? You are fools." Naira's blood ran cold as she realized the depth of their mistake. They had walked straight into the lion's den. The room erupted into chaos as Exodan soldiers poured in from concealed alcoves and hatches along the depot walls. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, illuminating the dark hangar with bursts of green light. Naira ducked behind a stack of weapon crates, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan. "Kian, Joran, hold your ground," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening barrage. "We're pinned," Kian yelled back, his rifle barking as he returned fire. This was a trap from the start. Naira gritted her teeth, her gaze darting to the charges planted along the depot's structural supports. The countdown on her visor read 4 minutes and counting. They didn't have time for a prolonged fight. "Joran, find us a way out," Naira ordered, firing a burst of rounds at an advancing Exodan. "Working on it." Joran's voice crackled with desperation. He had taken cover behind a terminal, frantically tapping into its systems in an attempt to override the lockdown. The Exodans weren't letting up. They moved with precision, their formations unyielding as they pressed the resistance into a tighter corner. Naira's heart pounded as she realized they were running out of options. "Naira," Kian called, his voice grim, "if we don't move now, we're not getting out of here." She knew he was right. The Exodans had the advantage, and every second wasted brought them closer to annihilation. But abandoning the mission wasn't an option. The explosives were set, and they had to detonate. "We hold them off until Joran finds us a way out," she said, determination hardening her voice. Kian gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. He shifted his position, laying down suppressing fire to buy them precious seconds. Zalzwar's voice boomed through the loudspeakers again, laced with smug amusement. "Humans, you persist in your defiance, but it will avail you nothing. This depot is your tomb." "Naira," Joran's voice cut through the noise. "I've got a route. It's not great, but it's open." "Where?" Naira demanded, firing another burst at the Exodans advancing on their position. "Upper catwalks. There's a maintenance shaft that leads to the surface." Naira's eyes flicked upward. The catwalks were a good 30 feet above them, and the only way up was a series of ladders, each exposed to enemy fire. "Perfect," she muttered under her breath. "Kian, cover Joran and me. We're going up," she shouted, already making her way toward the nearest ladder. Kian responded without hesitation, his rifle blazing as he laid down a wall of suppressing fire. Naira reached the ladder and began to climb, the metal rungs slick with sweat and grime. The Exodans were relentless, their plasma bolts narrowly missing her as she ascended. Joran followed close behind, his movements hurried but precise. They reached the catwalks, and Naira immediately took aim, picking off an Exodan soldier attempting to intercept them. "Move, move," she yelled, urging Joran toward the maintenance shaft. Below them, Kian was still holding the line. He ducked behind cover, his shots precise and methodical. Naira's heart clenched as she realized he was buying them time at the cost of his own safety. "Kian, get up here," she shouted. "Not yet," he replied, his voice tight. "Go. I'll catch up." Naira wanted to argue, but there was no time. The Exodans were closing in, and the explosives timer had less than a minute left. She and Joran reached the maintenance shaft, a narrow tunnel that led upward to the surface. Joran crawled in first, his movements quick and desperate. Naira hesitated, glancing back at Kian. "Kian, now!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Kian threw one last grenade toward the advancing Exodans, the explosion buying him a few seconds to sprint toward the ladder. He began to climb, plasma bolts peppering the air around him. Naira held her breath, her heart pounding as she watched him ascend. The timer hit 10 seconds. Kian, hurry. He reached the top just as the charges detonated. The explosion rocked the depot, a deafening roar that shook the entire structure. Fire and debris erupted in all directions, the shockwave knocking Kian off balance. Naira lunged forward, grabbing his arm as he teetered on the edge of the catwalk. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to let go. "Hold on," she yelled, pulling with all her strength. Kian scrambled to find his footing, finally managing to climb onto the catwalk. They didn't waste another second, diving into the maintenance shaft as the depot began to collapse around them. The tunnel was a blur of motion and noise, the sound of falling debris and roaring flames echoing behind them. Naira's lungs burned as she crawled, her mind focused solely on escaping the inferno. Finally, they emerged onto the surface, gasping for air as they collapsed onto the rubble-strewn ground. The depot was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater in the distance. Kian rolled onto his back, his chest heaving. That was too close. Naira didn't respond. She stared at the burning wreckage, her mind racing. They had won the battle, but the cost had been high, and the war was far from over. The sky above Adris Prime was dark, lit only by the fires of the battle that raged in the distance. The smoke hung thick in the air, a constant reminder of what they had just survived. Naira and her team moved quickly through the ruins, their bodies aching, their nerves on edge. Despite the victory at the weapons depot, there was a sense of unease that lingered over the group. The explosion had sent a clear message to the Exodans, but it had also marked the resistance as a real threat. Naira knew better than to let the momentary success lull them into a false sense of security. "We've got a problem," Joran said, his voice low as they navigated through the alleyways of the ruined city. Naira glanced at him, narrowing her eyes. "What's going on?" "I've been hearing rumors," Joran continued. "Something bigger is coming. The Exodans have activated their main fleet. They're not just going to fight us on the ground anymore. They're coming for the entire planet." Naira's stomach sank. The Exodans' empire was vast, their ships towering, their firepower unmatched. If they launched a full-scale invasion, it wouldn't matter how many weapons caches they destroyed on the ground. They wouldn't risk it, Kian muttered, his expression grim. "Not with their resources spread thin." "Maybe not," Jorn replied, "but I've been intercepting their transmissions. They've already mobilized a fleet from the Karath system. They're planning to make an example out of us." A silence fell over the group as the weight of the news sank in. Naira's heart raced. The stakes had just escalated. "What's the plan?" Kian asked, breaking the silence. Naira clenched her fists. "We need to stop them before they can launch the invasion. If they get control of the planet's atmosphere, we won't stand a chance." "How do we stop an entire fleet?" Kian pressed, skepticism thick in his voice. Naira turned to him, her face set in determination. "We don't stop the fleet. We stop the launch." The Resistance had always operated in the shadows, small raids, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. They'd avoided direct confrontations with the Exodans' full might, but now they had no choice. The Exodans had declared war, and it was time to fight back with everything they had. "Where's the launch site?" Joran asked, his eyes sharp. "Central Command," Naira said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "It's heavily fortified, but it's our best shot. We take that base. We take their ability to strike." Kian shook his head. "It's suicide. The Exodans will level the city to stop us." Naira met his gaze. "We don't have a choice." The next few hours passed in a blur as the team prepared for the mission. They scoured the Resistance's remaining resources, gathering explosives, weapons, and whatever intel they could. They knew the risks. If they failed, the Exodans would finish what they started and wipe out the last of humanity's resistance. But Naira refused to let fear dictate their actions. "We move at dawn," she said. The night was tense as they made their way to Central Command. The streets were eerily quiet. The city's once bustling markets and squares now empty, abandoned by the citizens who had fled or been taken. The hum of Exodus patrols echoed through the air, their ships flying low, scanning for any signs of rebellion. "We've got company," Kian muttered, pointing to the darkened sky. A fleet of Exodus ships passed overhead, their angular forms cutting through the night like predators searching for prey. Naira felt her blood run cold. They were close. "Stay low," Naira ordered. "We move quickly and silently." The Resistance had trained for moments like this, moments where stealth was their only weapon. They navigated through alleyways, hidden beneath the cover of ruined structures and abandoned vehicles. The Exodans had underestimated the humanity's resourcefulness before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. As they neared Central Command, the base loomed large in the distance. It was a fortress, walls bristling with weapons and defenses, the ground surrounding it littered with Exodus soldiers. "This is it," Naira whispered. Kian nodded. "Time to end this." They split into two teams, with Naira and Joran leading the assault, while Kian and the others covered their flank. They moved swiftly, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the dust-choked air. As they reached the outer perimeter of the base, they encountered their first challenge. A line of heavily armed Exodus guards, their plasma rifles trained on the entrance. Naira's heart skipped a beat. They had to get through. Joran drew a small device from his pack, a jammer. He activated it, and the guards' weapons sputtered, temporarily disabled. It was enough time for them to move in. "Now!" Naira shouted. They attacked in unison, their weapons barking as they fought their way through the guards. The Exodans were formidable, but the Resistance had the element of surprise. Minutes later, they breached the main gates, entering the heart of Central Command. The air was thick with tension, the walls lined with screens and monitors, the hum of Exodus technology filling the room. "There it is," Joran said, pointing to a large terminal at the far end of the room. "That's where they'll launch the fleet." Naira nodded. "We take that terminal. We take their fleet." But before they could make their move, the door slammed shut behind them, and a voice boomed over the intercom. "You are fools," Zalzar's voice echoed through the chamber. "Did you really believe you could defeat an empire? You are nothing. I am everything." "Shut him up," Kian shouted, his voice sharp. Joran worked quickly, hacking into the terminal, but it was no use. The Exodans had anticipated their move. The system was locked down. "Zalzar's here," Joran hissed. "We need to move now." But it was already too late. The door at the far end of the room slid open with a hiss, and Zalzuwayar stepped in, flanked by a small platoon of elite Exodus soldiers. His presence was imposing. The tall figure bathed in the cold, mechanical light of the command center. "I warned you," Zalziwayar said, his voice cold, dripping with arrogance. "You've done well to come this far, but this is where your journey ends." Naira's pulse quickened as she assessed the situation. Zalziwayar was too powerful to take down head-on. The room was packed with Exodus soldiers, their plasma rifles aimed directly at her team. There was no way out, not without losing them all. She needed a distraction, something that would give them the edge. "Joran, disable the terminal," she shouted, her eyes scanning the room for anything useful. Joran was already working at the control panel, his fingers flying over the console as he attempted to break through the lockdown. His brow furrowed in concentration, but Zalzar's men were closing in, their guns raised. "I've got it," Joran yelled, his voice filled with relief. But before he could react, a sharp crack echoed through the air, and one of the Exodus soldiers fired a blast at the terminal. Sparks flew, and the system went dead. "No," Joran cried, his hands trembling as he tried to restart the console. Zalziwayar smiled. "Did you think it would be that easy?" Naira took a deep breath, her mind racing. There had to be another way. They couldn't let the Exodans launch the fleet. If they did, everything they'd fought for would be lost. "Kian, take them down," Naira ordered, her voice firm. Kian didn't hesitate. He pulled a grenade from his belt and tossed it at the Exodans in the far corner, the explosion rocking the room and sending soldiers flying. In the confusion, Naira made her move, darting toward the terminal, her blaster raised. "Move now!" she shouted to her team, firing a shot that took down an Exodan soldier advancing toward them. They made it to the terminal just as Zalzar's mocking laughter echoed around them. "You cannot stop me, human. This station is mine. Your resistance will crumble under the weight of my empire." Naira's fingers hovered over the console, her mind racing. She could hear the Exodan soldiers regrouping behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps growing louder. But this was their only chance. If she could override the system and stop the launch, they could still win. "I'm almost there," Joran panted, sweat streaming down his face. Naira glanced at him, then back at the terminal. Time was running out. They had only moments before the Exodans regrouped and overwhelmed them. "We don't have much time," Kian shouted, his rifle aimed at the door. "Keep them off us." Naira snapped, her voice tight. The Exodans weren't going to give them much time. Naira's thoughts raced as the countdown timer on the screen continued to tick down. They were too close to fail now. "I've got it," Joran shouted, his voice full of triumph. "The fleet's launch protocols are disabled." Naira exhaled in relief. The room fell silent for a brief moment, and then with a crackle of static, Zalzar's voice boomed again, this time filled with fury. "You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable." With those words, the doors exploded open and the Exodans surged forward, weapons raised. Naira could feel the heat of the plasma bolts as they whizzed past her, too close for comfort. "We need to go now," Kian yelled. Naira turned to Joran. "Can you still hack into their systems and get us out of here?" Joran's fingers flew across the console, but the Exodans were already closing in. "Not without giving away our position. Then we fight," Naira said, her voice cold. The resistance made their stand in the heart of Central Command, fighting for every inch of ground as the Exodans pressed in. Naira could feel her strength waning, but she wouldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to victory. Kian fired round after round, holding off the Exodans as best he could. Joran kept working at the console, his face a mask of concentration. But Zalzar wasn't done. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Naira. "Do you think you can defeat me?" he sneered. "You are nothing." Naira's heart raced as she stared down the Exodan leader. This was it, the moment she had prepared for. "We are everything," Naira said, her voice steady, her hand tight around her weapon. Without warning, Kian moved, charging at the advancing Exodans, drawing their attention. Naira took the opportunity to sprint toward the heart of the room, her blaster raised. She fired at Zalzar, but the Exodan leader dodged with unnatural speed. The Exodans around them began to close in, and Naira realized they had only one option. They had to destroy everything. "Joran, do it," she shouted. Joran's face paled as he hesitated, but he nodded. He activated the self-destruct sequence. 5 seconds, Joran said, his voice tense. Naira didn't wait. She grabbed Kian, pulling him toward the door. "Now!" The room shook with the blast of the explosion as they raced through the corridors, the sound of collapsing structures filling the air. Naira could feel the heat of the flames as the station began to collapse around them. "Move faster," Kian urged, his breath ragged. They burst through the exit just as the entire station went up in a massive explosion, a fireball that lit up the night sky. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they ran, the blast sending a shockwave that threw them to the ground. Naira rolled onto her back, gasping for breath. The city was on fire, but they had done it. The Exodans were delayed. The fleet would not launch. "We did it," Kian muttered, his voice hoarse. Naira's chest tightened as she looked up at the burning horizon. "Not yet," she said, her eyes hardening. "We've only just begun." The aftermath of the explosion echoed through the shattered city. The The Resistance had dealt a powerful blow to the Exodus Empire, but the victory came at a steep price. Naira and her team had barely escaped the collapse of Central Command, their bodies bruised and battered from the explosion. But despite the damage, there was something more dangerous in the air, the realization that the fight was far from over. Naira's thoughts were scattered as she surveyed the devastation. The flames of Central Command's destruction still burned in the distance, the sky above thick with smoke and ash. They had succeeded in halting the fleet's launch, but the Exodans would be back. It was only a matter of time before they regrouped, and they would come for revenge. "We need to regroup," Joran said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "They won't let us go so easily." Naira nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. She knew the Exodans well. They wouldn't stop hunting them until they were eradicated. They had to prepare for the inevitable counterattack. But in the back of her mind, Naira couldn't shake the nagging thought. How much longer could they keep fighting? How much longer before the Exodans crushed them completely? "We're not backing down," Kian said, as if reading her thoughts. "We've made them bleed. That counts for something." Naira glanced at him, the weight of his words heavy on her shoulders. "That's the problem. They'll remember. And when they come for us, we'll need more than just hope." "We've got each other," Joran said, his voice firm. "And we've got the heart of this fight. That's more than they've got." Naira looked at her team, their faces bruised but resolute. They had risked everything for this cause, and they would continue to do so, no matter the cost. "All right," Naira said, taking a deep breath. "We regroup at the safe house. We'll need to plan our next move carefully." But as they made their way through the ruins of the city, Naira couldn't help but feel the weight of the Exodus Empire bearing down on them. It was a crushing pressure that seemed to seep into every corner of their world. "We're not done yet," Kian muttered, his gaze sweeping the devastation. "We've won one battle, but the war's far from over." The safe house they had been using as a base of operations was tucked away in the ruins of an old industrial district, hidden from the prying eyes of the Exodus patrols. But even in the relative safety of the crumbling building, Naira couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. The Exodans were ruthless, and now they had a reason to hunt them with everything they had. Inside, the team gathered around a table littered with maps, datapads, and other intelligence. Naira's mind was focused, her eyes scanning the information in front of her. They had delayed the Exodans' fleet, but it was clear that the Empire had a far-reaching grip on the galaxy. The resources they could muster were far beyond what the Resistance could manage. Joran pointed to a map of the Exodus territories. "They've got a staging ground in the Nabari system. It's a key location for their military operations. If we can hit that, we'll be able to strike at the heart of their supply lines." Naira studied the map, her mind working through the possibilities. The Nabari system was heavily fortified, but if they could take out the Exodus' logistical base, it would cripple their war effort. "It's a long shot," Naira said, her voice low, "but it's the best shot we've got." "I'll prep the team," Kian said, determination clear in his voice. "We're in this together. We'll take that base down." As the team began to prepare for the next phase of their operation, Naira found herself alone for a moment, staring out of the safe house's grimy window. The distant fires from the ruined city flickered in the night, a stark reminder of the destruction that had already taken place. She thought of the Exodans, of Zalzar's cold, calculating gaze. He had underestimated them once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "We can't afford to be weak anymore," she muttered to herself. "We have to show them what we're capable of. We're not going to just survive. We're going to make them fear us." The war wasn't over, and Naira wouldn't stop until the Exodans had paid for what they'd done. The Nabari system was one of the most heavily fortified regions in Exodus-controlled space, its orbital defenses seemingly impenetrable. But Naira wasn't about to let that stop her. As she stood in the command room of their makeshift operations center, surrounded by maps and schematics, her resolve only hardened. "We've got one shot at this," Naira said, addressing her team. "If we fail, We won't get another opportunity. The Exodans will wipe us out before we even get close to their supply lines. Joran leaned forward, his eyes scanning the holographic display of the Nabari system. We'll need to bypass their outer defense grid first. After that, we'll have to make our way through their blockade and disable the supply base before reinforcements can reach us. The plan was risky, but it was the only option they had. Every other system they had considered was even more heavily guarded. The Nabari system was crucial to the Exodans' operations, and if they could disrupt their supply lines, it could give the Resistance a chance to strike back. Kian cracked his knuckles, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sounds like fun. Despite the tension in the room, Naira couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Kian's confidence was infectious, and it helped to steady the nerves that had been gnawing at her ever since they had launched their attack on Central Command. We'll need to move fast, Naira said, bringing the room's attention back to the task at hand. Once we breach their defenses, we'll have a small window before they can react. If we're not out of there in 20 minutes, we're done for. Joran and Kian exchanged glances, both nodding in agreement. The Resistance had trained for situations like this. Risky, high-stakes missions with little room for error. But as much as Naira trusted them, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. "What's the catch?" Kian asked, breaking the silence. "The catch is the Exodans aren't as blind as we think," Naira replied. "They're going to have backup. Even if we get in, there's a high chance we'll be walking into a trap. So, no matter what happens, we stick to the plan and don't deviate." There was a brief pause as the team digested the weight of her words. Then, Kian cracked his knuckles again, a defiant grin on his face. "I like those odds. Let's tear their supply base down." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. The team outfitted themselves with the best gear they could find, making sure their weapons were ready and their navigation systems were synced with the ship's computer. Naira checked the status of the ship's stealth systems one last time. If they were caught before they reached their target, there was no way they would survive the assault. The air in the hangar was thick with tension as the team boarded the ship. Naira could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on her, but she pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation. Not now. As they made their way into the Nabari system, Naira couldn't help but wonder how close the Exodans were to discovering them. The stealth systems on their ship were top of the line, but even the smallest mistake could give them away. Approaching the outer defense grid, Joran reported from the cockpit, his eyes glued to the readouts. "We've got about a minute before they detect us. Activate the cloaking device," Naira ordered, her voice steady. "And don't stop until we're past their blockade." The ship hummed as the cloaking device activated, the sensors flickering as they began to blend into the backdrop of the stars. The tension was palpable as the Resistance ship glided past the Exodan defense grid. Naira's eyes were locked on the view ahead, watching for any sign of detection. The ship's cloaking device worked flawlessly, and they slipped past the defense grid undetected. But Naira knew that their luck couldn't hold out forever. "We're in," Joran said, his voice tight. "Now, let's get to the supply base." The team made their way through the Exodan blockade, weaving between ships and avoiding detection. The stakes were higher now. One wrong move, and they would be caught. The plan was simple: get in, disable the supply base, and get out. But as they approached their target, Naira's instincts told her something was wrong. "This is too easy," she muttered, her eyes scanning the perimeter. "Something's off." Suddenly, alarms blared, and the ship's sensors lit up with incoming targets. "We've been compromised," Joran said, his voice filled with urgency. "They know we're here." Naira's heart sank as she realized what had happened. The Exodans had been waiting for them. They had known the Resistance would strike at the Nabari system. "Brace for impact." Naira shouted. The ship was rocked by a sun barrage of fire, the hull groaning as the shields absorbed the blast. They had been caught in a deadly crossfire, surrounded by Exodan ships. The stealth systems had failed, and now there was no escape. "Get to the supply base," Naira ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We're not leaving without completing the mission." The team moved swiftly, darting through the ship's corridors and heading toward the docking bay. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the halls, and Naira's pulse quickened. They had to reach their objective before the Exodans overwhelmed them. "We're almost there," Kian said, his face grim. "But we need to hurry." The supply base was ahead, a massive structure towering in the distance. Naira could see the Exodan forces closing in. "We breach on my mark," she said, her voice cold and commanding. With a final nod from her team, they charged forward, weapons raised, ready to fight to the last. The air inside the supply base was thick with tension, the hum of machinery and the distant clatter of weapons fire filling the corridors. Naira's heart pounded in her chest as they pushed forward, their footsteps echoing in the cold, sterile halls. The Exodans were closing in fast, and time was running out. "Stay sharp," Naira ordered, her voice low but firm. "We've got one chance to hit their core systems. If we don't do it now, this entire operation is a failure." The team moved in sync, each member fully aware of the stakes. Kian and Joran flanked her as they approached the central hub of the supply base. The walls were lined with control panels, each one humming with the quiet pulse of Exodant technology. "We're here," Joran said, his voice barely a whisper as he knelt by a terminal. "I'll need a minute to access their systems." Naira glanced around, her senses heightened. The sound of footsteps was growing louder, the Exodant forces closing in on their location. She could feel the pressure mounting. "Hurry," Naira urged, her eyes darting to the entrance of the chamber. "Almost there," Joran muttered, fingers flying across the terminal's interface. He paused for a moment, then looked up. "Got it. I've unlocked their core network. We're in." "Good," Naira said, her voice tight with relief. "Now we overload their power core and get out. Fast." But as she turned to leave, a voice, cold and calculating, echoed through the intercom. "Commander Naira," the voice purred, sending a chill down her spine. "You think you can just walk away from this? You've made a mistake coming here." It was Zelzyr, Naira's worst nightmare. The Exodant commander had been waiting for them, his presence a sinister reminder of the Empire's reach. "Zelzyr," Naira spat, her hand tightening around her weapon. "I should have known you'd be here. You underestimate the power of the Exodans," Zelzyr said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you've won, but you're just a small thorn in our side. And now, it's time to end this." The door to the central chamber slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the sound of footsteps grew louder as Zelzar's forces began to flood the room. Naira's pulse quickened. The trap had sprung. "Take cover," Naira shouted, pushing her team into action. Gunfire erupted as the Exodant soldiers stormed the room. The resistance fired back, their blasters lighting up the darkened chamber with a deadly barrage of energy. But despite their efforts, they were outnumbered, and the Exodans were closing in fast. "We need a way out," Kian shouted, his voice strained as he fired his weapon. "There's no time," Naira said, her mind racing. The mission had shifted from sabotage to survival. The Exodans would destroy them if they didn't find a way out, but the power core was close to overheating. She glanced at the terminal. "Joran, can you trigger the core overload from here?" Joran looked up, sweat pouring down his face. "It's risky. If I do it, there's no turning back. The entire base will go up in flames." "We don't have a choice," Naira said, her voice steely. "Do it?" Joran nodded, his fingers moving over the controls. As he worked, the sound of gunfire intensified, and the Exodans closed in. Naira's heart raced. They were running out of time. Suddenly, the base shook as explosions rocked the structure. The walls cracked, and the ceiling groaned under the strain of the battle. Naira's team held their ground, but the Exodans were relentless. "Now!" Naira shouted. Joran hit the final key, and the power core began to overload. A blinding light filled the room, followed by the deafening sound of the base's collapse. The Resistance had done it. They had crippled the Exodus supply lines, but at a great cost. The base was coming down around them, and they had to escape before the entire facility was destroyed. "Move, move, move," Naira yelled, pushing her team toward the exit. The walls around them shook, and debris fell from the ceiling as they sprinted through the collapsing corridors. The final stretch was a blur of adrenaline. Naira's heart pounded in her chest as she led the team through the chaos. But just as they reached the outer bay, a large piece of the ceiling crashed down in front of them, blocking their escape route. "Not now," Naira muttered, her heart sinking. "Move," Kian shouted, grabbing a nearby piece of debris and using it to break through the rubble. With seconds to spare, they burst out of the base, their lungs filling with fresh air as they sprinted toward the ship. The Exodans had underestimated them once again, and now they were about to pay the price. The team piled into the ship, and the moment they were aboard, Naira slammed the door shut. "Let's go," she shouted, and the ship rocketed into the sky, leaving the Nabari system behind them. As they made their way into deep space, Naira allowed herself a moment of relief. The Exodans had suffered a major blow, but this war was far from over. But for now, the Resistance had won. The victory was bittersweet. As Naira gazed out of the ship's viewport, the swirling darkness of space reflected the turmoil in her heart. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. She knew the Exodans would retaliate, and their forces were vast. The victory at Nabari had been a significant blow to their empire, but Naira also understood how fragile their position was. "Status report," Naira said, her voice low, as she turned to her team. Jorn was seated at the control panel, his fingers dancing across the interface. "We've lost about a third of our forces. The base is gone, and the Exodans are going to hunt us down relentlessly. But we did what we came here to do." He paused, glancing at Naira. "We've taken out their supply line, and that's going to hurt them. A lot." Kian leaned back in his chair, his face a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Yeah, but it's just a start. There's still the rest of the Empire to bring down." He looked at Naira, his gaze intense. "And you've got their attention now. They'll be coming for us with everything they've got." "I know," Naira replied, her eyes narrowing as she thought about the future. "But we're ready. We have to be." There was a heavy silence in the room as each member of the team understood the weight of her words. They had done the impossible by striking at the heart of the Exodus Empire, but they knew the real war was just beginning. They were no longer the underdogs. They had become a threat, and that would change everything. "We'll need more support," Jorn said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "The Exodans will be hunting us down, and we can't take them on alone." Naira nodded, her mind already working through the next steps. "I'll reach out to the other resistance cells. We need to unite if we're going to stand a chance. We'll need more firepower," Kian added, his arms crossed. "The Exodans have the whole galaxy under their boot. We'll need an army, not just a few ships." The weight of his words settled over Naira like a heavy blanket, but she didn't flinch. "Then we'll build it, piece by piece. We'll take down their empire." Her voice was filled with quiet determination, and her team could sense it. They had come a long way since the first days of their struggle. They had fought against impossible odds and come out victorious. But the war was far from over. Naira knew that what they had just accomplished wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning. The Exodans had underestimated them, and they would continue to do so at their peril. The ship hummed as they traveled deeper into space, and Naira turned her gaze back to the stars. There were millions of worlds out there, and each one had its own story. But the one that mattered now was the one they were creating. The Resistance had ignited a spark, and it was only a matter of time before that spark became a wildfire. "Get some rest," Naira said, her voice steady. "We've got work to do." And as she settled into her seat, she realized that the war they were about to wage wasn't just about destroying an empire. It was about something much bigger. It was about freedom. And they weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for every world the Exodans had oppressed, every person they had silenced. The resistance wasn't just a small group anymore. They were a movement, a force that would stop at nothing to see the Empire fall. As the ship hurtled through the dark expanse, Naira felt a surge of hope, stronger than it had ever been before. The Exodans had underestimated them, thinking they were weak. But now, they knew better. And when the Empire finally fell, Naira would be there to see it. Standing tall, knowing that the battle they had fought had been worth every sacrifice. The Resistance had shown the galaxy what they were capable of. And now, the Empire would know fear.